The Russo-Japanese War was fought from February of 1904 to September of 1905, and catapulted Japan to world power status while accelerated the decline of Russia towards revolution. The war was fought over control of the Korean and Manchurian regions. Japan wanted Korea in their drive towards modernization and world power status. Korea is strategically located in relation to Japan and provides fertile agricultural lands, which will help the Japanese population grow. For Russia, they were looking to expand their empire and wanted a warm water port since all of their other ports froze over in winter. Japan had gained control of Korea up to the Liaotung Peninsula after the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, but after the triple intervention of Russia, Germany, and France, they had to release their claims on it. Still determined to regain it, they became friends with Britain to make sure no other powers would get involved, then prepared for war with Russia. Time to compare the two forces. Going into the conflict, Russia was widely considered to be able to easily handle the small island nation of Japan in a war. Russia had a peacetime army of over 1 million men, with 2 million more in reserve, while Japan had a strength of only 270,000, with only 200,000 in reserve. However, Russia had only roughly 80,000 in the Manchurian region at the start of the conflict. This gave Japan a decided advantage in the initial stages of the war. Their Far East naval forces were much more equal. The Russian Far East Navy had 7 battleships, 7 cruisers, 25 destroyers, and 27 other smaller vessels, while Japan's had 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, 40 destroyers, and 40 other smaller vessels. Japan's were all British built though, so they were better quality and speed than Russia's. The Japanese strategy was to strike hard and fast early, taking as much key strategic ground as possible in the initial fighting, before Russia could throw in the massive weight of their manpower reserves into the fight. While Russia planned to set up a strong defensive line until the reinforcements from the Trans-Siberian Railroad could be brought to bear in a counteroffensive. The war began with a surprise attack. Admiral Togo launched the attack on Port Arthur on the night of February 8, 1904, catching the Russian Navy off guard since there was no formal declaration of war. On land, the Japanese landed forces at modern-day Incheon Harbor and drove north toward the Yalu. The Russian army, being outnumbered, formed a defensive line at Laoyaoyang on the crucial railway line just south of Mukden. Once the Japanese army crossed the Yalu, another invasion force landed at the base of the Liaotung Peninsula. Part of these forces would swing left to take Port Arthur, while the rest of them would combine and head north to deny Russia the ability to come down and relieve Port Arthur. The Left Hook Force won the key battle of Nanshan, which cut off Port Arthur from Manchuria, and continued to slowly lay siege to the port city. Port Arthur eventually did surrender on January 2nd of 1905. To the north, the Right Hook continued to advance into Manchuria, leading to the Battle of Mukden. The key battle took place on February 20th, 1905. The Japanese utilized a pin and hook strategy where one force would attack head-on, giving the impression of being the main assault, while another force looped to the west to cut off the railroad north of Mukden. The Battle of Mukden was one of the bloodiest single battles in human history at that point, and featured a lot of the same characteristics as World War I, with human wave tactics against fortified trenches involving machine guns. It was also the last land battle of the war. Japan was at the end of its manpower reserves, while Russia was starting to get the weight of their manpower reserves into the Manchurian region, but events at sea ended the war before this took effect. At sea, after the Port Arthur surprise attack, Admiral Togo attempted to block in the Russian fleet into Port Arthur and prevent it from sailing up to Vladivostok to link up with the other Russian Far East fleet. The Port Arthur fleet only made one significant attempt to make that link up happen. In August of 1904, they made a break for it, only to be intercepted by Togo's fleet, forcing most of the Russian ships back to Port Arthur to be scuttled or destroyed by the advancing Japanese land forces. With Port Arthur looking doomed, Nicholas II sent the Baltic fleet to relieve the port. The flotilla was 50 ships strong, including 4 new battleships. The journey was brutal. They had to go all the way around the tip of Africa, and mutiny, disease, food spoiling, and the deteriorating conditions of the ship plagued the whole journey. By the time they made it to Singapore, Port Arthur had already fallen, and now they were tasked with linking up with the fleet at Vladivostok. Limited coal supplies made the journey east of Japan impossible, so they had to go through the Strait of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo was waiting to strike. The iconic battle pitted 8 Russian battleships against Japan's 5, but Japan's British-built battleships were of much higher quality. The Battle of Tsushima on May 28-29, 1905 was a massacre. Admiral Togo utilized the Japanese ship's big 12-inch guns and crossed the Russians' T, devastating them with cannon fire. The total Russian losses were 6 battleships sunk and 2 more captured. Out of their other 30 ships, 15 more were sunk and 9 others put out of action. The Russian lost 5,000 total killed, while Japan lost only 3 torpedo ships and 117 dead. Tsushima was the last action of the war. Afterwards, Teddy Roosevelt reached out to both parties and brought them to the negotiating table. At the negotiations in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Russians conceded that Japan would retain Port Arthur on a lease, recognize Japanese predominance in Korea, would withdraw their forces from Manchuria, and transfer the southern portions of the Manchurian rail lines to Japan. But they rejected Japanese demands for an indemnity payment, or for the surrender of the northernmost island in the Japanese island group group of Sakhalin. Japan was low on money, coal, ammunition, and manpower, so if the war continued, they were likely to lose their positions in Manchuria and possibly Korea, so they inevitably accepted those terms. However, the peace left a deep resentment by the Japanese public against the United States, feeling the US had colluded to keep Japan from gaining too much power. This would eventually lead towards a collision course on who would be supreme in the Pacific. While the embarrassing loss in the war to a much smaller nation helped to accelerate the decline and collapse of Imperial Russia, eventually leading to revolution and communism.